The topic of this lecture is tissues, and in particular we're going to look at two specific types of tissues. Those are the epithelial tissues and the fibrous connective tissues. Now, just a quick refresher about what a tissue actually is. Tissues are structures composed of similar cell types, and they provide basic building materials that we use to construct organs of the body. This shows the basic concept of what a tissue is. Here we have epithelial cells, this type of cell. Notice the nucleus there, notice the cytoplasm. Now, if we get a lot of these epithelial cells and put them together, we can form an epithelial tissue. The epidermis of the skin, that's the outer superficial layer of the skin, is an example of an epithelial tissue. It's composed of groups of epithelial cells organized into this specific structure here. And this is showing you where the location of the epidermis would be in the skin, the superficial layer. So a tissue is composed of similar types of cells. In the next part of this lecture, I'll focus exclusively on the epithelial tissues. And in particular, we'll spend a lot of time looking at the lining epithelial tissues. So here we have a basic concept slide providing an overview of what the epithelial tissues are. Epithelial tissues, as I've said before, are one of the four major tissue types of the body. The other three being muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and connective tissue. Epithelial tissues are composed of tightly packed cells, and we're showing that here. So here's an individual epithelial cell, nucleus, and the rest of the cell, the cytoplasm, and the other organelles. Combine a number of these epithelial cells together, and you have an epithelial tissue. In this slide, we're presenting where epithelial tissues are typically found. They can be found lining the inner or outer surfaces of many organs of the body. For example, in this image here, we have the epidermis of the skin, the outermost layer of the skin. As we can see here, we're peeling off this sheet of material. That is composed of epithelial cells. It is therefore an epithelial tissue. Epithelial cells will also combine to form tissues that are used to create glands. Here we have the salivary glands, and glands secrete products such as sweat, mucus, hormones, digestive fluids, and so on. Another location that we will typically find epithelial tissues is in combination with other tissues to form complex sensory receptors, such as the eye and the organs of the inner ear that are responsible for our sensations of balance and also of hearing. Before we go on, let's review some of the major structural features of epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues are characterized by very little material between the cells, so the vast bulk of the tissue is composed of cells. As we can see here, there's a couple of images of epithelial tissues. That's a side cut view, and that's a superior view there. And what's evident is that the vast bulk of the tissue is composed of the epithelial cells. There's very little else between them. The cells are the major structural component. Epithelial tissues lack blood vessels. We call that avascular. There is often evidence of lots of cell division occurring in epithelial tissues. And epithelial tissues will have cells that are attached to a basement membrane, as we can see here. Now, in anatomy, we like to classify structures, and epithelial tissues are classified on the basis of two specific criteria. Firstly, the number of cell layers present in the tissue and the shape of the cells in the tissue. If we have a single layer of cells in the tissue, we call that a simple epithelial tissue, as seen here, single layer of cells. If we have multiple layers of cells in the tissue, as seen here, we refer to that as stratified. The other criteria we consider when classifying an epithelial tissue is the shape of the cells. If the cells are flat, we refer to them as squamous. If we cut the tissue side on and the cells appear approximately cube-shaped or square-shaped, we call them cuboidal. And if we have tall column-shaped cells in the tissue, we call them columnar. An important concept to remember is that the appearance of the cells in the tissue and the number of layers present in the tissue can often give an idea of the specific function of that tissue. In this lecture, we'll focus primarily on the lining epithelial tissues. Those are the tissues that we find typically lining the inner or outer surfaces of organs in the body. On this side, we have simple epithelial tissues. Each of these consists of just one layer of cells. Notice, however, the shape of the cells varies substantially. This one here, the cells are very flat. We call that simple squamous epithelium. Here, when we cut the cell side on, it appears roughly square, so each cell approximately square in shape. Simple cuboidal epithelium. Tall column-shaped cells in this one, just one layer of them. Simple columnar epithelium. So each of these tissues has just one layer of cells, but the appearance of the cells in these tissues varies substantially. And the naming system reflects that. On this side, we have the other types of epithelial tissues that we'll be looking at. Stratified epithelial tissues are composed of multiple layers of cells, as we can see here. If you notice the shape of the cells up the top here, the apical surface, they appear flat or squamous, so we call it a stratified squamous epithelium. This tissue here, it has a funny name, pseudostratified. That means the false appearance of stratification. These tissues, when you look down the microscope, initially appear to be multi-layered because the nuclei, as you can see there, are at different heights. However, each one of these cells is actually attached to the same basement membrane, so it's technically a simple epithelium. So it's a simple epithelium that appears to be stratified, pseudostratified. Before I leave this slide, I'll just note these terms here, keratinized and non-keratinized. That refers to particular types of stratified squamous epithelia that I'll talk about soon. In this slide, we have an example of where we might find a simple squamous epithelium. It's in the lung. In structures we call alveoli. Alveoli are the points in the lungs where exchange of gases occur between the air, this is the air here, and the blood. You can see evidence of blood vessels here with the blood cells inside. So here in the alveoli, oxygen from the air will be able to diffuse into the blood. Carbon dioxide in the blood will be able to diffuse into the air. Simple squamous epithelia is an excellent tissue to allow this to occur. It provides an adequate barrier between the blood and the air, but it's thin enough to allow diffusion of gases. This shows a second type of simple epithelia, a simple cuboidal epithelia, and the image here makes it quite clear that the cells, cut side on, appear roughly square. So a square in a three-dimensional context is a cube, simple cuboidal epithelium, single layer of cells that appear approximately cuboidal. Here we have a structure composed of simple cuboidal epithelia. This is part of the nephron. I've spoken about that when I looked at the urinary system previously. We talked about structures called nephrons that were there to help us form urine. There were tubules where the filtrate from the blood was processed to urine. Lining these tubule cells is simple cuboidal epithelium at this location. Notice if we trace around this individual cell here, we can see the spherical nucleus, circular nucleus, and we have approximately a square if we sort of form around that cell there. Single layer of cuboidal cells. These cells are thicker than the squamous ones we saw in the lungs. They have more cellular machinery in them, more organelles. They're required to actively help form the urine. They're not just there providing a passive barrier between structures. So they have to work, they have more cellular machinery, therefore they are thicker than the simple squamous epithelium. This provides an example of simple columnar epithelium. It's found in the lining of the intestines, the inner surface, where we have the interface between the tissue of the intestine and the lumen here where the food that has been digested will be located. Notice this structure here, that is a simple columnar epithelium, a tissue composed of a single layer of column-shaped cells. The nuclei of the cells are oval in appearance and are located towards the basal region of the tissue here. In this location, the simple columnar epithelium would assist with the absorption of nutrients from the contents here within the intestine. So in here, the enzymes from the pancreas would help break down complex food molecules to simple nutrient molecules. They would then diffuse across this epithelium and be carried off in the bloodstream. So single layer of column-shaped cells, simple columnar epithelium. Now, if we closely examine many of the simple columnar epithelial tissue types, we notice these projections from the apical surface of the cells. There are a couple of different types of these. There are what we call microvilli. These we might find in structures such as the small intestine or the tubules of the kidney, the nephrons, and they increase the surface area of the cell to help allow absorption of materials. So where you want to encourage more absorption to occur, you will put in these microvilli. The other extension from these cells are cilia. Now, cilia are able to actively move materials. You might find these, for example, in the lining of the airways, helping to propel dust and mucus and keep it away from the lungs. So many of the columnar epithelial cells that we examine have these apical surface projections, microvilli or cilia. So that provides an overview of the simple epithelial tissues. Ones I'll move on to now are the stratified epithelia. And as I've already mentioned, the stratified epithelial tissues are characterized by multiple layers of cells. More than one layer of cells, you've got a stratified epithelium. Here we've got several layers. Now notice how the shape of the cells can vary considerably from one part of the structure to another. Here we have the basement membrane. This is the basal layer here. This is indicating the cells dividing, and you notice the cells there appear approximately cuboidal. However, if we move to the apical surface, what you notice is the cells appear flat. They're squamous. Now, when we classify this tissue, we will take into account the shape of the cells at this apical surface. In this slide, we'll review one of the major types of stratified epithelial tissue in the body, that is the stratified squamous epithelia. As I mentioned before, the shape of the cells in these tissues varies substantially. Basal layers can appear short, columnar, or cuboidal. The apical surface often appears squamous, and it is on the basis of this apical or upper layer here that we give the tissue its classification on the basis of shape. So stratified, multiple layers of cells; squamous, the cells up here appear flat. As I mentioned before, proliferation is often occurring in these tissues, as indicated by the dividing cell here. And what will happen if this is, say, for example, within the skin, you'll get division of cells here. Those progeny of those divisions will then start to move up through the tissue, up to this point here, and then eventually they'll be lost. And new cells will be created underneath there, and they'll come through and replace the cells that are lost. So there's a high turnover of cells within these tissues. Now, when we look at the stratified squamous epithelia, we tend to see two main types. There are those that are keratinized or non-keratinized, and this refers to the presence of a particular type of protein within the cells that makes the cells a lot tougher and water repellent. Now, where you have a stratified squamous epithelia that is subjected to a high level of stress, this would be, for example, the outer surface of the skin, you will incorporate into that tissue a lot of cells that are full of this material we call keratin. We therefore refer to this tissue as keratinized stratified squamous epithelia. So it's a stratified squamous epithelia that's been highly modified to be tough and resistant to abrasion and to provide a very effective protective layer. The cells accumulate the intermediate filament protein keratin, and collectively the whole thing is referred to as being keratinized cells or a keratinized tissue. Here we have an image showing you the epidermis of the skin. It's an epithelial tissue, and I'll just point out a few things to you here. So there's the skin there, we magnify that. That's what we have on the outer surface, the epithelial tissue called the epidermis. Cells here are a typical stratified squamous epithelium. There's lots of cell division occurring here. The cells move up here, they become squamous. However, once they get to this region here, they essentially undergo a type of cell death. In that process, they are filled with the tough intermediate filament protein called keratin. It's very strong, keeps the cells tightly bound together, makes them very tough, able to resist abrasion, and it also helps provide a waterproof layer. We would find this kind of tissue, as I've said before, in structures such as the outer surface of the skin, which is subject to a lot of abrasion. Other areas we might find it are the gums and the hard palate of the mouth. Once again, where there's a lot of abrasion occurring. It's a good, tough, protective layer. I'll briefly finish up with a couple of specialized epithelial tissues. The first one is transitional epithelium. This is specialized for the urinary system. And if we have a look at it, at first glance it seems to be a stratified epithelium, and that's correct. However, unlike the stratified squamous epithelium, the cells at the top appear to be dome-shaped. This sort of tissue is found lining the urinary bladder, the ureters, and the urethra. In their empty state, when there's not much urine there, this is how the tissue will appear. Cells roughly dome-shaped, tightly bound together. However, when you start to fill the structure up with urine, so for example the urinary bladder is filling up with urine, the cells here will stretch as the organ fills and accommodates that increased volume. So the cells undergo a transition in shape from dome shape to squamous. So this is transitional epithelium, specialized for structures in the urinary system. In this slide here we have that other unusual epithelial tissue type that I mentioned before, pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Remembering that the term pseudo is a reference to false. This tissue essentially appears to be stratified. Under the microscope, here we have one of these types of epithelial tissues. Notice the nuclei piled on top of one another. That would appear to be stratified. However, if you examine the cells closely, you notice that they actually all attach to the same basement membrane. So technically, it's a simple epithelium. You will find this in areas such as the respiratory tract, trachea, bronchus, and if you look closely, you'll notice there are cilia present. And those cilia are helping to brush away mucus and dust. Another location for this is in some of the reproductive ducts in males, particularly the epididymis. I have one final slide referring to the epithelial tissues. This is just a brief reference to glandular epithelia. Glands are structures based on epithelial tissues that secrete something. These are a range of products, things like hormones, the hormone insulin. We also have structures making secretions such as digestive enzymes in the pancreas, or mucus and the products of saliva from the salivary glands. Glands are based on epithelial tissue. The glands can be based on one cell, that's what we call unicellular. Here we have the lining of the small intestine. The epithelial tissue is evident here, and what we can see are the odd cell scattered throughout the epithelial tissue making mucus. There's a droplet of mucus there. So that one cell in the tissue making mucus, it's a unicellular gland, what we call a goblet cell. We can also have multicellular epithelial glands. These are structures such as the salivary glands, the liver, and the pancreas. The other thing we consider when classifying the glands is whether the material is directed straight into the bloodstream. If that's the case, it's an endocrine gland. If the material is directed into a specific system of ducts, we call it an exocrine gland. So that completes the overview of the epithelial tissues. What we'll move to now are connective tissues, and in particular a class of connective tissues we call fibrous connective tissues. Here we have a brief summary of connective tissues. Connective tissues are one of the 4 basic building materials of the body. It's actually the most abundant tissue in the body, and it has a range of functions. It provides support and protection For example, the skeleton, the bones, the ligaments are composed of connective tissue. Connective tissues help bind materials. We'll talk about tendons and ligaments and fascia, and that helps wrap and bind materials together. Insulation, for example, adipose tissue helps insulate the body from cold and also from physical trauma. Storage, adipose tissue is a store of energy. Transport, that is specifically referring to blood. Blood is a fluid connective tissue. Now, in this image here, we have a good representation of a connective tissue here. What is evident are many conspicuous fibers. These dots here, they are the cells of the connective tissue. And unlike the epithelial tissues we looked at before, connective tissue cells are often widely scattered throughout the tissue. What I'll do now is just give a brief overview of the major elements of any connective tissue. There are two main things in these connective tissues. There are cells and a material outside of the cells that we refer to as matrix. We'll talk firstly about the cells and connective tissue. They are sparsely scattered when compared with epithelial cells. So here we have a bunch of connective tissue cells in a connective tissue. And as you can see here, they're not all tightly packed together. They're kind of scattered around a bit. And they're not directly opposed to one another. There's a naming system that we have for the cells in connective tissues. Typically, the name will contain the suffix blast if the cell is responsible for manufacturing the tissue. If it has the suffix site after it, it refers to a more inactive cell within the connective tissue that's just responsible for maintaining the tissue. This shows three main types of connective tissue cells. We have a fibrocyte, which is found in fibrous connective tissues, and that's what this lecture is going to focus on. We have chondrocytes, which are the cells we find in cartilage, and osteocytes, which are the cells we find in bone. The other material we have in any connective tissue, apart